Hey everyone, it's Sleepy Reader, aka Damien, and it's my comic book thoughts video for the week. Well, I wanted to talk about the 13 comic books I picked up on May 19th, I think it was, this past Wednesday, that I've read during the week. I kind of got to them a bit late, and it felt like, even for 13 comics, it felt like an extra chunky read. Some of these comics were pretty long, chunky comics, I guess. So, and I was reading a lot of other stuff before I got to them. Maybe I'll mention that at the end of the video. So I will do my usual ranking just by how much fun I had reading each one, counting down from number 13 down to my number one book. I wouldn't call it my pick because I'm not necessarily recommending it for other people. It's just letting you know how I felt about them. So my number 12 and my number 13 both they were the two books I really was really annoyed with. So I'm putting at number 13, Kojikaru the Skinner, issue number 2. Boy, there's a lot of ripples on that cover. This is actually a really nice cover, really nicely colored, and throughout the art on this is nice and well colored, pleasantly colored, in kind of the, what would you call it, the Dave Stewart style. And this is part of the one of those, the secondary Mike Mignola universe, which he's now calling the Outerverse. And it's just a 2-issue miniseries, and you should totally skip it unless you have deep knowledge of Mignola's Outerverse, because none of it had landed any meaning or significance to me other than there was a big fight with witches who worked for the Nazis. And the fight wasn't even fun because there wasn't much you could tell was going on, or who was who and what the losses were, or anything like that. So it was just kind of a frustrating read. Far more of a frustrating read, but also maybe far more unique, is Crime Destroyer. It's a one-shot from All Time Comics / from Floating World Comics, who now publishes All Time Comics. And I was so excited. A giant-sized comic of Shaky Kane artwork. Shaky Kane has just done a bunch of odd comics over the years. You don't see him that often. I don't think he's done a regular comic since, what was it called? The Airtight Coffin? Something Coffin. But every once in a while he's done one-shots at Image that I've really loved. But this was just so, for me, unreadable. So hard to actually read the dialogue. I know it's supposed to be some kind of avant-garde take on either the Bronze Age or the 90s era comics. This Crime Destroyer has appeared in some of the other all-time comics. So it's not Shaky Kane's fault. Shaky Kane is not the writer. The writers were Jason T. Miles and Josh Simmons. And, maybe I'm just clueless as to the avant-garde approach they take to their joke pulp comics, but it just didn't work. It just was so hard to read. There was one point where I was like, oh, well, maybe I'm wrong, because here, these lyrics to this song playing on the radio are pretty cool. Twist away the gates of steel, unlock the secret voice. I didn't recognize those words until at the bottom it said Gates of Steel by Devo. And so that was the only good writing in the whole comic, was the lyrics to Gates of Steel. So the one thing I can thank them is reminding me of this really good Devo song, the title of which always eluded me. I did not know it was called The Gates of Steel. So I've watched that quite a bit this past weekend, different performances by Devo on YouTube, and got it on my music app. So anyway, this was probably the huge disappointment of the week and maybe the month, because I'd really been excited that there was going to be more Shaky Kane. The coloring is a bit odd at times too. Not odd in a good way, but odd in that it just kind of doesn't work very well with Shaky Kane's. I wonder if he did his own coloring with Shaky Kane's art. Maybe he did his own coloring. It doesn't say. It doesn't mention who did the coloring. And maybe this coloring would have looked fine on slick paper, but this is really nice matte paper, and it maybe changed the way the colors worked. I had super low expectations for Black Knight #3. I did not like Black Knight #2, and I said I wasn't going to pick it up anymore. But I don't know. I was just in the mood for some pulpy fun, and I saw that he was going to be fighting Thor in this issue, so I grabbed it off the racks. And I think what we have in here is a kind of fun, pulpy story, but in the telling, it's very awkward. And I don't know how much of that to blame on maybe the artist, who's probably just a typical Marvel guy they got cheap from Eastern Europe or Latin America or something. I'm just guessing. I hope I'm not saying some really horrible things. But, or maybe it's just the whole editorial process at Marvel. But one example is in this picture, we see Dane Whitman's black sword, which is kind of a interestingly cursed black sword that feeds power off of your negative emotions. It goes flying from his hand, and then it lands. It lands in the dirt. But the next thing we know, this girl is holding it. But where was the girl? How did she get to the sword before Mordred did? Why isn't there a panel showing her picking up the sword? That was odd. So, and then she immediately has the sword knocked out of her hand, or fall out of her hand because it's too evil for her to handle. And then in the next panel, Dane Whitman has the sword again. Where'd he come from? His horse's head just got chopped off. How did he, it's strange. And so there's all kinds of just awkward transitions and stuff. But it was kind of cool, this flashback to when he or whoever was the holder of the sword, centuries and centuries ago, battled Thor and some Vikings and defeated them. And Thor's memory was erased. Anyway, so there's a lot of, this was kind of a push and pull. Some cool pulp ideas and some really awkward presentation of those ideas. I guess I probably, after I've dissed the artist so much, I probably shouldn't even say his name. Okay. Then at number 10, a comic I actually like quite a bit, I put Wonder Woman at number 10, basically because I didn't get a feel for where the plot is going yet. There's some interesting plot elements that Joelle Jones, I was looking for her to be reminded of her name, but it's so small you can't read it on the cover. That some interesting plot elements that writer-artist Joelle Jones has kind of thrown up in the air, but I can't tell where they're going. We got a lot of different scenes in different places in Brazil, in various mythological locations. I assume this opening scene was a flashback, but I'm not sure a flashback to where. Somewhere, was it Themyscira? I don't know. Some incredible, beautiful art. I hope DC realizes that Joelle Jones is their current superstar. She is by far the most exciting artist doing mainstream DC comics that I can think of at the moment. And she's a talented writer, and you put all that together, and it's kind of exciting, wondering what she will do next. And will she stay at DC? I mean, I loved her Lady Killer. I'm kind of sad about that. But if I'm reading DC Comics, it's great to have Joelle Jones in there with you. So yeah, it's just hard to tell where this thing is going. I'll probably pick up the next issue. I'm still kind of reluctant to pick up many DC Comics. I might also just kind of wait a while and see what people are saying about it. In at number 9, Scumbag, doesn't, in a way, it just does not deserve to be above that Wonder Woman issue. But for whatever reason, I just had some fun reading it. Another very silly issue. Another artist. Every issue has a different artist. The weird thing is, I would have thought Oh, my computer's going to sleep on me again. I would have thought that I did. Oops, sorry. If people remember me struggling with the computer last time, I did go fiddle with the settings, but apparently that wasn't enough. I would have thought that this was a different colorist, but it's the same colorist every issue. And the style of coloring here kind of, I mean, it's cool panel to panel, but when I look at each page, I'm like, it kind of throws me away. It's so intense, maybe. But it's interesting. And, Scumbag continues to be Scumbag and make jokes at the expense, but not particularly brilliant jokes about various different ends of the political spectrum. And our Scumbag keeps trying to get laid, and it never quite succeeds. We do get to see a very overweight, elderly, naked woman here, so I think that's very notable. You don't see that in American comics too often. So anyway, there's that. It was at number 9. And at number 8 is Redemption. Kind of, if there were such a thing, a guilty pleasure. This is pure pulp, full of cliches, except everything's flipped with cliches being about women gunfighters instead of men in a post-apocalyptic Wild West. It's still a lot of fun to read. And I really like the art and coloring. But the cliches are fast and heavy here, including the older gunfighter who doesn't want to help and says she won't help. And then, of course, we know she's going to help in some fashion. So Redemption continues to be fun. Okay, now here is... Oh, wait. I switched around my list, and probably for good reason. So in at number 7 was the Immortal Hulk, Time of Monsters. And it perhaps suffered a bit because I always have high expectations of Immortal Hulk. This is a one-shot, and really I think Al Ewing's only involvement was in the co-plotting of the first story in here. There's 2 stories in here, I think like a 20-page story and a 10-page story. This, first of all, magnificent art on both the stories. And Juan Ferreira really showing off what he can do with his kind of, I think it's digital, but digital semi-painted style. It almost looks like it's done with pastels and chalk and things like that, things you rub with your finger if you're an artist. That's my general impression. But story-wise, it was, for me, it just didn't land terribly big. And I'm a little frustrated by this idea of the green door as it has existed throughout time or throughout humanity's history, creating Hulks at all different times. I don't know, that's like the Swamp Thing now has become the champion of the green that has existed throughout time. That's interesting, but also kind of, I don't know, to me kind of distracting from the Bruce Banner Hulk story. So different people I think would take it different ways. But and also, it didn't have too many problems in terms of visual storytelling. But here in the first splash page, there's just a whole lot of writing here, and you have to kind of read it carefully to understand everything they're telling you here. And it took me a few pages later to understand everything that was being told here. And in my thinking, a better writer-artist team, I mean, I don't really know who's at fault, would have done a series of small pictures showing some of the things that are described in here, and then it would make sense. Because I think basically what's being said here is, once this was a fertile land, and then this thing from outer space fell and created what this character is calling the eye of the goddess or something, and the land became barren. And why couldn't we have a panel of the fertile land and of the meteorite landing or coming down through the atmosphere or something, so that we readers can understand more of what's going on here? And plus, it's just making better use of the visual medium. It's kind of it just seemed epidemic, not epidemic, emblematic of the current things that they've lost in comics that the writers and artists often don't think to do anymore. That in an old comic, written by Roy Thomas and drawn by John Buscema, we'd get a few panels laying out visually what we're talking about that happened in the past. And why not do that? I don't know. I'm sure there's reasons you could argue why not. Anyway, it was a treat to see Juan Ferreira's artwork in this kind of pre-Dawn of Civilization era. And then another treat, we got a Kevin Nolan penciled and inked. The credits, on both of these, the credits and the title are at the back of the story, which to me makes no sense. It just does a disservice to the reader. So this one was written by David Vaughn, who I'm not a name I'm familiar with, and art and colors and letters by Kevin Nolan. And in this, Bruce Banner meets the Scarecrow. I guess there's a Scarecrow who in many ways resembles the Scarecrow in the Batman comics in the Marvel world. And it was a very well-structured short horror story playing off of what we know of the Immortal Hulk now, ending with even a nice kind of Devil Hulk nod. So I really enjoyed that story more. Also a completely different art style, but a real treat to see Kevin Nolan, a more old school comic book artist, I guess. I'd like to see more Kevin Nolan in modern comics. That would be really nice. Actually, my number 6 is somewhat of an old school style, maybe with very new school coloring. Derek Robertson, most famous for doing his being the artist on Transmetropolitan with Warren Ellis, has written and drawn, I assume it's a miniseries, they don't say how many issues, this thing, Legends of the Dark Knight. And I always loved the original Legends of the Dark Knight series, so that immediately caught my attention, and then I saw the art. This cover's very nice, and I thought, well, we'll see. With an artist writing, that's not always a good thing. I had not heard about Derek Robertson doing writing before, but he does a very solid, if very standard Batman story, but he does it very well. So I enjoyed it a lot. His art was very good. The coloring choices to me were not as good as they could have been. Obscured his art occasionally, which is interesting when you've got these. Oh, there's another one where the credits are at the back, the credits and the title. It was called Bad Night, Good Night. Like, why do you have to save that title to the end? It's not that good of a title, but it doesn't give anything away. Derek Robertson was the writer and penciler and did some of the inks, and Diego Rodriguez, who's a name I'm unfamiliar with, did the colors. So if you enjoy a really solid Batman story with a lot of his rogues gallery thrown in, again, it's kind of the thing I've been saying. I've had too much Batman, and it all seems kind of the same. But this came close to taking the edge off just by doing it really well. But still, it does have that same old feeling to me. But yeah, it was a pleasure. It was still a pleasure to read. Derek Robertson is a good writer and a good artist, and that's great to know. Okay, and then in at number 5. So this one is weird. I could have ranked it really low. Instead, I ranked it kind of high. I was super excited that, one, that we were going to get another Mark Russell comic. It's written by Mark Russell, still most famous, I think, for his run on the Flintstones, where he transformed the Flintstones into something indescribable. And it's the Fantastic Four life story. They'd already done the Spider-Man life story, which was a mixed bag for me. Like, it had some good issues and some bad issues. I guess, what was it? It was written by Chip Zdarsky and drawn by Mark Bagley. And this is drawn by an artist I never heard of before, Sean Azaxi. I wonder what kind of name that is. It almost sounds like a not focusing there. It almost sounds like a African name to me. But there's no, if it is an African name, it probably is not. There's no special flavor to the art. It's very generic. That is supposed to be a young Reed Richards. Obviously, that's President Kennedy. So it starts in 1961, year of my birth, and sets up this rivalry between Reed Richards and this bald scientist who, if you think of a bald scientist and you've read all the Silver Age Fantastic Four, you realize it's the guy who trades places with Ben Grimm the Thing in the most famous, or one of the most famous Stan Lee, Jack Kirby stories, This Man, This Monster. And that eventually pays off it does become the This Man, This Monster story by the end. But so my first complaint was the art. It was too generic. This artist probably is a very talented illustrator, but I don't feel like he's particularly right for this project or particularly invested in this project, I'm guessing. Although he did come alive whenever he got to draw Galactus. Let me find that. There were a few, but he also seemed to be into drawing the Thing. I thought he did a good job on the Thing. And that's often a problem, artists who can't draw the Thing well, but there's his Galactus. So the art was kind of bland, and then, and just, lacking in any kind of pizzazz. I think that's what I want. I want some personality, some pizzazz in the comic that originally created the Marvel Universe and gave it personality and pizzazz. It all came out of the pages of the Fantastic Four. And so this is the Life Story series. Each issue is an entire decade in the lives of the heroes and shows them moving forward. So, of course, you just get little slices. But what Mark Russell does here is he changes certain key aspects of the Fantastic Four that seem to me to be terrible choices. But I guess I had fun kind of picking it apart. And the biggest mistake in my mind is Reed Richards and Ben Grimm are not best friends from the past. In the regular comics, they were roommates. They knew each other from college. Ben Grimm was a football champion. Reed Richards was the school genius, and Reed and Ben, I guess, fought in World War II, and Ben went on, or maybe the Korean War. Anyway, Ben became a famous fighter pilot, and instead Ben is some kind of unnamed, undecorated just dude, some pilot who sits around in bars drinking, who Johnny just happens to have a faint acquaintance with, I guess from his hanging around in bars. I'm not sure, since Johnny is underage at the moment. They do create a clever scenario that explains in a more real world terms why they would be sneaking onto a spaceship. So they had a spaceship that was ready to go, and then it got canceled by the rival scientist, and it was going to be dismantled by the next day. So that's why they snuck in that night to give it a test run to prove Reed Richards' theories were right. But and it is nice that Sue is made into a scientist, which is kind of like how Sue was in the Ultimate Fantastic Four. It makes her relationship with Reed make more sense. So that part kind of fixes things, but the whole thing, the tragedy of Ben Grimm being turned into a monster, that Reed Richards feels responsible for turning his best friend into a monster, is gone. He's just some guy, and he is angry about being turned into a monster, and that's an issue. And then the whole other aspect of the Fantastic Four was that they're like a family, but Reed Richards, Mark Russell wants to kind of play it up more, that they don't hang out together too often, and in fact they might even go months or years without getting together. Maybe that just fit into his vision of how he would tell this story that lasted decades. But then when you're taking the basic idea of this man, this monster, where a scientist takes on Ben Grimm's form and pretends to be Ben Grimm and goes into Reed Richards' laboratory to steal his ideas and to prove that he's not as good. And then he discovers what a great friend to Ben Grimm Reed Richards was, and what a brave and noble person Reed Richards was. And then the Ben Grimm character, the evil scientist looking like Ben Grimm, or not the evil scientist, the jealous scientist looking like Ben Grimm, then makes his own sacrifice to save Reed Richards. But none of that happens here because he's just gone in to try to kill Reed Richards. And he just throws Reed Richards into the negative zone, where for some reason they meet Galactus. So it's not the same negative zone, I guess. And he just he pushes Reed Richards through and says, "You got to survive because you can stop Galactus." So he makes a sacrifice, but it's kind of a sacrifice for the human race, not a sacrifice out of friendship and realizing how great someone's friendship and nobility was. It just all plays so differently, and to what point. It takes away sort of the greatness of the Fantastic Four and makes it kind of meh, in my opinion. Now, I think people will like this better who aren't deeply invested in those Kirby and Lee days. I kind of grew up with them because they were in reprint comics that I was buying at the same time I was buying early 70s Fantastic Four. I was also getting mid-60s Fantastic Four in the World's Greatest Comics reprints when I first started reading comics. So I very much imprinted on the Kirby and Lee kind of way of presenting the Fantastic Four as this fun, squabbling family group who really loved each other, and none of that comes through in this. And that always seemed to me the greatest aspect of the Fantastic Four. So, like, it's kind of making, even I'm fascinated to see what Mark Russell will do with this, but it's making me wonder, like, where is this going next? Because you just don't have that strong relationship between the characters to play with over the years. Or do you? I don't know. The other thing that is interesting here, because I remember when Mark Russell did, I'm sorry I'm going on so long about this, when Mark Russell did the Flintstones, at first I wasn't going to read it because I heard interviews with Mark Russell saying, well, I never was a fan of the Flintstones. But there's this theory that sometimes is thrown out there that, like, bring in writers who don't care about superheroes and they'll do more interesting things than the fanboys of superheroes or of comic books in general. Sometimes people say, oh, my advantage in comics was that I didn't grow up loving comics. So maybe, maybe the writers didn't grow up loving the Fantastic Four of this era, and his advantage is that he didn't love it and he can break it down and not be bothered. But I think that cuts two ways. Sometimes coming in on something without the love for it and the deep kind of having lived with it is a weakness too. Would you say that someone who starts writing poetry after never have not read much poetry in his life and becomes a poet will become a better poet than someone who's loved poetry all their life? I don't know. That's perhaps not a one-to-one kind of thing, but anyway, it made me think of that whole argument, because every once in a while you hear that with certain people in comics, that it's somehow their advantage that they didn't grow up fanboys. We fanboys are just, we're weak. So I got angry there. My number 4 book was Engine Word, which continues to be a fun and fairly complex sci-fi story that also always has some kind of flaws to it. Flaws isn't the right word. Some awkward bits. And in this issue, the awkward bit was this giant info dump. Again, I think the old school comic book people would have done a lot of panels to illustrate some of the things she's talking about. It was not as bad here as in the Hulk because I could follow what she was saying and everything. But at first, when I flipped to these pages, I was like, I don't want to read that. I do not want to read that. But when I read it, it was okay. And it kind of filled in all the answers that I thought, exactly as I had thought things had gone. So it all just confirmed my understanding of the story so far. So there's 2 more issues left. For those people who like to see the occasional topless woman, there is one in here. It's a pretty cool comic. The art has continued to improve, and maybe the color, and the story has coalesced nicely. It'll probably, unless there's some twist that I'm not anticipating, it'll probably end in a kind of straightforward way, with the bad guys overthrown and the new order, the new, more just order put into place. So if something else than that happens, I'll be surprised. In at number 3, and I know this was a lot of people's number 1 comic in videos I've seen, Lalia, The Many Deaths of Layla Starr, issue number 2. A really excellent comic. I don't know where this one is going, even though it has a bunch of Neil Gaiman-ish touches. This felt like a more restful issue than the first issue, with more sort of filling in background on various people. I think we were getting a bit of a view of the caste system in India. It wasn't 100% clear to me, but I mean, not in any way that I felt befuddled or anything, but I assume that's what we were getting. We get, a long conversation between Lalia. I keep calling her Lalia because my daughter has a friend named Lalia. Between Layla Starr and a crow. And we get set up for another life in the next issue. But yeah, it's interesting. It's fun. It's really well drawn and colored. But it was not my most favorite comic of the week. In most weeks, this would have been. Ultra Mega 3 was really good. When I was talking about the first 2 issues, I was saying he has lots of, he being James Herron, the artist and writer, has lots of great ideas, but maybe will grow as a writer in future comics he does to structure them better. But I felt like by this issue 3, the structure of the story had improved greatly, and it was much more linear and led me through events and feelings and action and emotion and plot elements in a really nice way, except for the first 2 or 3 pages that I'm still a little puzzled by, but not in a terrible way. So given that if everything were a bunch of scenes like the scene in the first one that I half understood, it would have been a pain in the neck. But this is a very hefty comic. It must be like 48 or 50 pages-ish. And I don't know. The coloring might not be quite as, I don't know, something may be changing in Dave Stewart's coloring. I'm not sure. I can't quite put my finger on it. Some of the pages I thought the colors were not as they jumped out at me in a way that normally Dave Stewart's colors have a more subtle effect on me. And sometimes they jumped out in a way that I found distracting. But anyway, that is being very picky because it's still much better coloring than almost every other comic I read this week. But it was really cool, and it really finally got a real clear focus on the idea that somehow all the kaiju, and there's a lot of them, have been turned small. So that's kind of a very clever twist on the kaiju genre. And so the kaijus have made this miniature city where they have the sort of human-sized kaijus, now human-sized kaijus, fight humans in this city so that they look like giant kaijus. And that was very clever. Maybe it's there's an example of the colors that kind of jarred me a bit. Maybe it's a bit more of a standard adventure story now in this issue than it was in the others, but still with lots of imaginative and unusual bits and pieces, and really great art by James Herron. So I'm extremely pleased to feel more confident in his writing and loving his art and his ideas. So that was a really good comic. But my number one comic might be my number one comic, or the series, which wrapped up this week. My number one comic for the year. Definitely my number one comic for the year so far, the first 5 months of this year. It's Rain Like Hammers. It was issue 5. It's probably like 60 pages long, 50, 60 pages long. So the entire book, 5 times 6, it's like a 300-page graphic novel spread out over these 5 issues. And it read really well in individual issues. But I am excited to go back and reread them all together. For me, this is a modern masterpiece of comics. Now, it may not be universally acclaimed ever, partially maybe because it's got this, or maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I hope to be wrong, and I hope it does. I hope the rest of the world of comics someday views this as much of a brilliant comic as I do. But it is a very personal kind of story told in a very unusual pace, which, I don't think it's a very personal kind of tone and pace for Brandon Graham. And I think it's also an evolution from him out of his previous work, from the best of my memory of what previous work of his I read. An evolution, not a revolution, but clicking in a new way. And so by the end, we do feel like we got a solid, real plot to the whole story, and all the elements connect together. And yet, during the journey, it seemed like this relaxed wandering through landscapes and stuff, wild, far future landscapes and wild, far future technologies and bizarre characters. So for me, I mean, I love far future science fiction, especially when it's done very imaginatively. But that might be kind of a smaller niche. So I think, if I could be the director of my favorite comic book creators and could tell them what to do, I would have told them, well, add a few more pages at the end to give a few more beats to our characters that we've been following all along, because now we have a different view of what the story was all about and what it meant to them. And so but maybe it's good to sort of be left with this kind of wistful feeling of there's still a bit that has to be done in my head about what this means to these characters' lives for the rest of their life. I mean, we are shown a bit of an epilogue in a sense of what they are up to afterwards. It's only that I wanted even more of that for whatever reason. But really, Brendan Graham gave us everything we need. And that's what he did throughout this series. It was a seemingly elusive science fiction story where really everything was there. And I guess I quickly picked up on reading it at a slow pace. I would not sit and try to read an entire issue at once, and I would go back and look at pages and stuff, and it made it work perfectly. So yeah, I'm super excited to reread it and somewhat excited to see what Brandon Graham will do next. I imagine he'll need some breathing space before he comes up with something this amazing. And I think it's signed at the end. Where did I see it? Yeah, it's signed Cinco 2021 April. So the 5th of April might be when he drew this last drawing. So he basically just finished it a month ago. And you don't produce masterpieces every day, I suppose. And he has notes at the end talking about some aspects of it and how it went in directions he didn't expect, and how it was all about working out things going on in his own life, which is interesting to work these things out in a far future. It's very metaphorical then. A very different kind of, it's not autobiographical comics, and yet he imbued it with whatever was going on in his life anyway. Which is maybe I just love science fiction and I connect to it on an emotional level. And maybe this, because it was the emotions and states of mind of the author hidden within the science fiction landscape, made it particularly appealing to me personally. So that's my number one. After I reread all 5 issues, I may or may not choose to do like a very spoilery video about the whole series. I don't know. That might ruin my fun of it to analyze it too much. I thought I probably took a long time doing this. Oh yeah, look at that, 40 minutes already. I have no awareness when I'm talking of how much time's going by. But while I'm at it, I'll just show you quickly what else I was reading this week. I've been reading digitally on the Hoopla app, the Peanuts Dell Archive. I had no idea until running into this on Hoopla that there were in the 1950s short 4 to 8 page comics done for Dell magazines, a few by Charles Schultz and some others by a friend of his who does an excellent job capturing the Peanuts vibes. Sassaville, I think was his last name. Anyway, these, if you like Peanuts, these are a delight to read. I've only gotten halfway through the book now. It's a 350-page book, and I'm about on page 190. And it does say in the intro that the last few ones were done by other artists that weren't his friend and didn't put as much effort into it. But anyway, it's great to see these Peanuts characters true to the Peanuts comic strip, but in a 4 to 8 page story. It gives it a different rhythm. The humor takes on a slightly different kind of twist where the jokes pile on each other instead of in one day after another, but all in one page after page after another. Anyway, I really like that. And then the other thing I've been reading digitally, not a comic, on Kindle, is a autobiography by Rudy Sarzo, the bass player for many bands, including Quiet Riot, and before that for the one of the early incarnations of Ozzy Osbourne's solo band, the Blizzard of Oz. And this book is focused on that Blizzard of Oz era and his friendship with Randy Rhoads. So it's kind of a book about Rudy Sarzo and a book about Randy Rhoads, the great first guitarist for Ozzy Osbourne, who died tragically. So why am I reading this now? It's the fault of YouTube. In my random journey through YouTube, I sometimes listen to interviews with old rock stars and stuff. And I stumbled across Rudy Sarzo talking about his days in Ozzy's band. And he mentioned that he'd written a book, or they mentioned he'd written a book, and I looked for it on Kindle and grabbed it. And I've actually found it really fun to read. So what page am I on? I'm on page 167, chapter 13 right now. I'm a bloody guest in your hotel. The most striking thing about Ozzy in these stories, he's not even the central character in a sense. Randy Rhoads and Rudy are. But Ozzy just goes around peeing on people and shitting in things. The wacky rock and roll life doesn't sound so fun if it's all urine and feces. Another non-comic book thing I'm reading is The Earth of the New Sun, which is the 1-volume sequel to the 4-volume Book of the New Sun, which I think I actually talked about reading a year or two ago in one of my sleepy vlogs. I'm nearing the end, and it's a very frustrating read. It's fascinating, but frustrating. And then a delightful read. I just poured through this book about Franz Kafka, written by David Zane Meyerowitz and drawn by Robert Crumb. It's still in print, I believe, and it comes from Fantagraphics, and I really liked it a lot. And it's rekindled an interest in Franz Kafka, and maybe to look for other odder Crumb projects too. But yeah, an excellent time if you're interested in literary history or Franz Kafka, or just want another book with Robert Crumb art. And then, let's see, I read 2 volumes of Infinity 8, Volume 3, which I enjoyed, but found the art to be a little lacking. And then this is by a bunch of European artists, but published by Lion Forge. And then Infinity 8 number 4, and each volume has a different, I think there are 3 issues each. Each volume, hardback, has a different artist. And so I really enjoyed the art of Martin Tristram on volume 4, and it was also a good story. So maybe I'll do a full-blown video when I read all 8 volumes, maybe not. But you can hear me talk about them at greater depth on the weekly chat I do with Comic Crack and Earl Grey and La Raza, and I'll put a link to the last one down there. So I talked about both of these and about the Robert Crumb book on that video, and I also talked about reading this obscure to me short-lived black and white Conan magazine from Marvel in the 90s called Conan the Savage, which this issue had an interesting Val Mayrick, Mike Barron story that felt like we only got half the story. And I looked up and it was never continued elsewhere. And then a garbled but fascinatingly illustrated story by, what was this guy's name? Someone else I'd never heard of, Neil Hansen. And when I looked up Neil Hansen in some database, it seems this is the very last comic he ever drew, which made me sad because I was thinking, well, because he was writing and drawing. And so I'm like, well, his writing needs to develop more, but his art is already really cool, and maybe some future stories by him doing Conan would be really nice. But no, because there are no future stories by him doing Conan. So anyway, that's kind of what my week's been like as a reader. Obviously, been spending a lot of time reading. I don't watch much TV. When my family goes to bed, I just read, or when I have free time during the day at lunch or something, I read. So I'll talk to you all again later. Bye-bye.